people on the Western diet, their brains are just aging so much faster as compared to people who are on healthier diets.
You had given this example of the people in your scans that were eating the Western diet versus not. Let's start off first with the lifestyle aspect of diet. What do we know about diet and its impact on hormones?
Right. So what we know about diet is that the foods we eat really have an impact on the health of our brains. And I think as a society, we're more comfortable with the notion that we feed our bodies and that the foods and diets that we choose will have an impact perhaps on our choice of clothing or our waists, our muscles, but we're less aware that we're also feeding our brains and that the nutrients that we put in our bodies will probably have an effect inside our heads as well. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that foods also have an effect on hormones. Right? There's a strong correlation between diets, like you mentioned right now, and hormonal health on many different levels, whether obesity, diabetes, insulin resistance, thyroid disease, but also menopausal symptoms. So we really need to eat to optimize our health, not just the way we look, but also the way we think. And as a scientist who is really involved in women's health, I went through the research that's been done specifically in women, because we know that men and women need somewhat different diets, right? Because we have different hormones, we have different muscle fibers to some extent. I mean, we're not different beings, obviously, but there are some differences that could potentially explain why women crave chocolate more.
And differences at different ages too.
And different
when you're
ages.
young and you're a woman who's in her prime of fertility, you might have different requirements.
More chocolate.
But
but it's true. More iron, more protein.
Sure.
Yes.
I've even heard like a lot of women who are young in let's say 25, like in the 25 to like 40-year-old age, and they want to have kids, they haven't had kids yet, and they try like an extreme keto where they cut out all carbohydrates. Typically, we've gotten a lot of women that say, okay, it doesn't work the same way for me as it might work for a man, especially as a man like at our clinic, at the Ultra Wellness Center. So there's so many areas where even though we are similar, we're all human beings, that we do have to personalize things appropriately for women and men.
Yes, for sure. And we respond to diets very differently also depending on the menstrual cycle, honestly, which is something that many diets just don't consider. So in the first part of the cycle, when your estrogen is really high, your metabolic activity is higher. So you can definitely tolerate more carbs, for example. In the second part of the cycle, where the estrogen goes down and the progesterone goes up, then you're going to need 3 times the same kind of stimulant, for example, to feel the same effect, which is when women have a tendency to perhaps overdo it a little bit with the chocolate. So there are a few physiological things that one needs to take into account. And I think the research is pointing to, the research has pointed to the Mediterranean diet as a diet that seems to be really supportive of women's health. And I would argue that perhaps it's not just the diet as much as the lifestyle that is really lower stress, more consistent, low intensity physical activity, but you just keep your body moving all the time. And the food is definitely higher quality than in other, societies, like when you go to Duane Reade and there's donuts everywhere. So it's perhaps a lifestyle that it seems to be more conducive to improve women's health. But it is interesting that the Mediterranean diet contains foods that are quite rich in estrogens in the form of phytoestrogens or estrogens from plants. So what's interesting is that estrogen is the most ancient of hormones, so it can really go across species. So the estrogen that a plant makes has a similar effect in a woman's body as our own estrogens, which is really nice. Now I think the nature works all together in that we can get hormones from a plant and just they become part of our own hormonal system. I think it's quite nice. And of course, there are some phytoestrogens that have been associated with some health risks, like soy. Soy is perhaps the richest source of phytoestrogens, but many people have allergies to soy. And the soy that we have in the United States is very often genetically modified or very highly polluted, so it's perhaps not the best choice. But then there are other foods like flax seeds. They're a great source of estrogens from plants. Sesame seeds, chickpeas, most legumes, as well as dried apricots for some reasons, and a number of fruits. And also dark chocolate contains a form of phytoestrogen that is potentially biologically active in a woman's body.
So we know the Mediterranean diet, and we'll come and I want to talk about a few more things with the Mediterranean diet.
Okay.
Going back to some of the factors inside a diet, one of the things that we've definitely seen an increase of as diets all around the world have become more westernized. Even in places like Italy and Europe and other places, everybody's sort of following the unfortunate trend that the United States has set, is we've seen a massive influx of sugar into a lot more foods. So what do we know about sugar and how it plays into a role with the items that you're talking about?
Well, so refined sugar wears out your pancreas, right? It really decreases your insulin sensitivity and increases your risk of insulin resistance. And insulin, being a hormone, works in balance with all your other hormones. So if you have hormonal imbalances, whether thyroid disease or insulin resistance, prediabetes, that might also impact your sex hormones and your reproductive functionality. So I think in general, I don't know if it's just sugar, but there's a lot of evidence that processed food is really not good news for health in general, but also especially for women's health. And there's this incredible study with over 100,000 people that came out in the British Medical Journal showing how consistent consumption of processed food is associated with an increased risk of cancer, of all types of cancers, but also over 12% higher risk of cancer, of breast cancer for postmenopausal women. Whereas there's another really big study showing that regular consumption of fish, especially fatty fish, and also legumes, is associated with a later onset of menopause. So anything that can delay the onset of menopause, I think, is beneficial to women in some ways.
I want to take it back to your personal journey because when you are, I can imagine, going for your PhD is a very intensive time.
Yes, it was.
And you are coming from Europe where things are much more inherently connected to the land and food, and you don't have to work as hard to get that. Yeah. And then in the US, there's a lot of bad habits that are here often. Yeah. How did you find in your own journey as you were going through this literature with those roots that you had of eating a Mediterranean diet, coming from, it sounds like a very healthy family.
Yes.
How did that shift, or what did you become more aware of as you came to the US when it came to your own health?
Well, I became acutely aware that chocolate chip cookies make you fat. We don't have them in Italy. And I moved to New York. I had no money as a PhD student. And all my friends were eating these enormous cookies. They were as big as pizza, and they were so fantastic, and they just went for it. You know, we don't have cafeteria-style food in Italy. And that's all I was eating. And it completely... I couldn't recognize myself. Like, I gained so much weight, and I just could not think straight. And it took me a minute to realize that that was actually what I was eating. Because back then I was looking at genetics, I was looking at family history, I was looking like genetic mutations for Alzheimer's. Nobody was talking about lifestyle as something that could actually impact your brain, especially diet. It took a long time for the field to really say, yes, food has an effect on your brain and Alzheimer's risk. And so I was really not prepared for the effects of that diet on me. And my mom was the first, actually my dad was like, sweetheart, you know, we have to do something here. So try to go back to eating the way we used to. And then the weight went away, thank God. And I realized I had to go to a gym because I didn't get the kind of exercise that I used to get in Italy. Just little things, but like doing the stairs all the time. My parents live on the 4th floor of a walk-up, and it was very normal for me to just go up and down the stairs all day long. And here it's all elevators, so I was taking the elevators instead, and I wasn't walking that much. I was taking the subway, and so I really had to turn it around and And my brain responded so quickly, which is really what made me interested in lifestyle when other people were not quite talking about it yet.
It's fantastic. It's always interesting, our own personal experiences.
Yeah, traumatic.
And how they, traumatic and, and how they impact our journey of what we're interested in. I mean, the whole reason that I got into health is because I had severe acne in high school. And I later on found that through just severe gut dysbiosis, I had intolerance to dairy. I wasn't lactose intolerant, but I had an inflammatory response. And so after cutting out dairy completely out of my diet, my acne completely went away.
Nice.
So it's always interesting the journey that we have and how that leads us to where we are.
Yeah.
So, okay.
I also heard that you have a problem with bell peppers. Is it possible? She mentioned that. Well, I do. I'm intolerant.
Yes. So I am very reactive to a lot of nightshades.
I got it.
So tomato, like if the skin is still on, bell peppers, I get very red in my face. Who knows what the origin of that is? But yes, the things that we figure out about our health.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So when men or women come to you and talk to you about, okay, now I know the stats.
Right.
Women are more likely for X, Y, and Z and all the things that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast.
Yes.
And we know lifestyle factors contribute. And we know that they show up as early as our 40s, right? Like later 30s, 40s. What are some of the things that you tell, let's focus on women because that's what, the angle is. And for the men that love them and are in their lives, what are the things that are the highest return that you have them start to focus on at that age to impact the likelihood of Alzheimer's and other degenerative brain diseases or brain tumors that might come later down in life? So when you start off at the top in terms of you usually prioritize this first and then and this next. I'm sure they all matter.
Yes. So I'm going to show you this very quickly. Where is it? What I usually tell them is this. There's a sentence in Latin that I'm sure you're familiar with. It's mens sana in corpore sano, which means a healthy mind in a healthy body. And if you take just the beginning, mens sana, then you have M for mental stimulation, E for exercise, N for nutrition, S for sleep. We have another S for stress, A for avoiding toxins, another N for networks, and the final A for medical assessments. And
this is part of your 8-step plan that you put together. Can you explain what that's called? It's called the Well-Nourished Brain.
Oh, the 8 steps to a well-nourished brain. Yes.
That's the same thing as what you were talking about.
Yes, right? It is the same thing.
Or it's just a coincidence that they both have 8 steps.
I think the 8 steps is more like the diet.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, there are 8 things that one can do to optimize their diet.
Let's talk about this one first.
These are 8 things that people can actually do. And what I always say to our patients is that it's up to them to decide which one is most important to them, because we have some patients who are super healthy in terms of their diet and exercise levels, but they're so stressed out. They're shaking when they come to the office. They're under so much stress. They can't sleep at night. So for them, stress reduction and sleep management are really the absolute priorities. So I think it's really important to check these 8 things and what are you doing okay already and what is not so great and how can you make it better. Yes, what's missing in your life at this point, and then let's try to address those. If I had to just choose 3, my top 3 would be number 1, diet, because almost all of us, we eat 3 times a day. So we have 3 chances every day to really make, how can you make it better? Yes, what's missing in your life? Exercise, number 2. There's a ton of evidence that keeping your body going really also helps your brain staying young and healthier and makes it more resilient. And for women in particular, there is literature, there's research done specifically in women, and it did show, like you were saying, that age plays a big role in hormonal health as well. So when women are premenopause, their muscles, their energy levels, everything is more conducive to a higher level of intensity in terms of exercise. You don't have to do it, but you could. Whereas after menopause, it's a little bit more difficult to really engage in high intensity activities. And so many women just feel so bad about it. And they almost beat themselves up. So part of what I'm trying to do is to just say, it's okay. It's not about having a standard. It's not about following trends. It's really about what works for you and your body and your mind at this stage in your life. If you can't do spinning, it's okay. Just find something else that you like to do, but do it consistently. So what research has shown is that consistency is really key, rather than intense bursts of activity and then it takes you 3 weeks to recover because your hormones are not there to help you out, and maybe you're so stressed that your cortisol is up to the roof and your adrenaline doesn't make you sleep. Just try to find an exercise that really helps you feel at your best. So that would be my number 2. And number 3 would be stress reduction.
And that's a big word. And
which one?
It seems stress reduction is like, it's a simple word, but it's a big
It's
topic.
a huge one, yes.
Because part of what you were saying before is that part of what maybe be influencing, kind of like the research in the blue zones, could be influencing the Mediterranean diet and how impactful it is just the Mediterranean lifestyle as a whole. So when you work with the women in New York at Cornell who are asking for the recommendations that are out there, or you're talking at different places and forums to audiences, and the topic of stress reduction comes up, how do we create a little miniature Italy in our own lifestyle and embrace that? What have been the things that you've seen that are most impactful for people when it comes to stress reduction?
I think it depends on why you're stressed, right? There are many people in New York are stressed because of work. We all work very long hours. We have very little time for self-care. And I think there's research showing how for women also holding full-time jobs and having a family and raising small kids and taking care of the elderly parents and trying to perform as well as a man in the same position while being paid less. There are a lot of psychological stressors as well that really seem to peak when women are in the ages of 25 to 45, according to I don't remember which enormous entity in the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. There's also evidence that women tend to suffer more stress than men, or at least they internalize stress perhaps more or have more symptoms because of the same levels of stress. And I think it's in part that women don't have a lot of time to really take care of themselves. Perhaps we're not good at making the time, but as a new mom, I can totally relate to that. I used to exercise very consistently, and then now I really had to plan for it. You just don't have that hour and a half that you just, I'll just drop off at the gym, and no more. Now you go to the playground. It's a really difficult, it's a different life that you have at some point, and it's a beautiful life. It's just really important, I think, to find ways to reduce stress that work for every individual woman, and everybody is different in many ways. Yoga is something that works for a lot of people. Meditation has been shown in clinical trials to really reduce cortisol levels in stressed out women, including those going through menopause. So it's a good thing to know. Green time over screen time. Doing this kind of weekends without social media, or try not to check your email before bedtime. Try to really optimize your sleep. Try to sleep longer if you need to, or at least to sleep better so that you're not disrupted when you're sleeping. There are a number of things that...
So you mentioned something earlier, and I'd just like you to hypothesize, or if you have any literature to reference to.
Okay.
Why is it I've heard this a few times for some guests on the podcast. You said that there seems to be some research that women internalize stress more than men on a whole, and everybody's different people are different, that sort of thing. But do you have any thoughts as to what could be some of the contributing factors that lead to that? Is it societal pressures? Is it What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts, but I think what makes sense to me is research from sociology, showing how men and women have somewhat different ways to react to stress. We all have the flight or fight response, right? Where you're under threat and then you either punch the threat in the face or run for the hills. In women, what happens is that, yes, you do have that initial response, but it's a little bit blunted because at the same time we get a surge of oxytocin, which is the love hormone, that makes you actually reach out to people and tend and befriend. Is called the reaction that is specific to women. The anti-stress reaction for women is the tend and befriend response that seems to have developed a really long time ago when our ancestors still lived in very primitive societies, and the men would go out hunting, so they needed to have a really strong fight or flight reaction because they were the ones who went chasing other animals or procuring food. They were more exposed to dangers. Whereas women would would stay back and take care of the children and the grandparents, and were more like gathering whatever they could in the environment. But it made more sense for women to really help each other out in times of stress, right? Bonding and asking other women for help, because it's really hard to fight when you have a little baby that you're holding. You can't really run for the same exact reasons. So it made sense to really gang up and perhaps chase the tiger away with sticks and stones and whatnot. But it looks like that response somehow got wired into our limbic system. And there are specific parts of a woman's brain that are more interconnected with the frontal cortex, which is in charge of reacting. They kind of shut down in times of stress because of the oxytocin release. So I think what happens to women today is that, yes, you can reach out to other women for help, but very often you don't have time, or to your husband or to your friends and family. But very, very often you just don't have the time to do that. You just soldier on and keep going, and you don't have the time to just have a 3 hours long conversation where you're really venting or, going out shopping with your friends. And that might be that we just don't know how to get this stress relief that we need.
That maybe in the past, if I'm hearing you correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong. So what I'm hearing is that maybe in the past, through our evolutionary biology, that, again, broad generalizations, but that women would solve challenges, face problems in the community of others,
yes,
and would reach out. And that was part of their ability to cope and deal with stress. And not having that in the way that we don't live in villages the way that we did before, these tight-knit families that are all under one roof, that the impact of stress that's now happening solo because of modern society could potentially leave women with more of the feeling that the stress is on their own shoulders and they don't have anybody to reach out to.
Right. And there's some research with brain scans showing that women's brains really kind of flare up in times of stress, whereas women's brains kind of shut down in a way where maybe you'll just go to the gym and work out and feel better quickly. Like if you can get some kind of intense stress relief activity, that really helps a lot for men, but not much so for women. So I think we just need to find stress relief techniques that work better for men and for women by looking at genders differently. And
this goes back to your core thing that we're talking about here on the podcast, is that if we're not researching,
yes,
then we don't know. We can't assume that what works for one works for another. Sometimes it does. And of course, women should honor their own intuition.
Right.
And not just feel like they have to do something that somebody else is doing, because maybe that research was based on research around men.
Well, actually it was. All the research on the flight or fight response was mostly based on studies in men.
Wow.
Which is part of the bikini medicine thing we were talking about, but also the fact that women were actually excluded from research for so many years because there was it was thalidomide. I don't know if you knew that. It's this drug that was given to pregnant women to deal with symptoms, and then it turns out that it created a lot of health issues in the babies, deformities, and a lot of other problems. And the FDA took a cautionary stance, which makes perfect sense, and said that women of childbearing age, which is any woman from puberty through menopause, should not be included in experimental clinical trials. Which again makes sense, because if you don't know the side effects of a drug, it is perhaps a good idea to avoid giving it to pregnant women at least, right? Mm-hmm. But that kind of escalated to the point that women were just excluded from research, period. Mm. And if you're not participating in research, you're not informing research either. So for decades, most clinical trials were really in men, were done in men. And so a lot of the recommendations and a lot of the medical knowledge that we have still today is really based on research in men. And that is a problem when certain things just don't work for women, right? Like Ambien, the sleep drug, women were getting overdose.
Yeah, no, expand on that, please, because I don't know if everybody in our podcast is familiar with that. So,
right, so Ambien is the most common sleep medication in the United States, and is metabolized differently in women than in men, in that women metabolize the drug faster. And nobody really thought about that. They knew it, but they didn't think it was such a big problem. And so women were getting the same dose of Ambien as men. But then a number of doctors and scientists reported that that just wasn't reasonable, because women were literally killing themselves by sleepwalking in the morning or driving a car while still kind of being a bit drugged. And so there were so many reports of car accidents driven by women who just had taken the Ambien the night before just to try and sleep, but they still had this drug in their bloodstream. And so after many doctors and scientists really were knocking on the door of the FDA and said, you have to do something about that, then the drug was reevaluated, and now women are given half the dose that's given to men.
Wow.
But for many years, women just overdosed on Ambien just because the drug was not dosed correctly for women. Or even, did you know that female Viagra was tested in 23 men?
Yeah.
It's so bizarre. It's just so bizarre.
So there was one item on that list that you showed on that, based on the Latin inspiration of the word.
Yeah.
And it was toxins.
Toxins, yes.
Let's talk about toxins a little bit. How do toxins impact our risk of some of these chronic diseases?
Right. So it's a great question. And I have to be clear that there is no consensus on that in the scientific world, if you will. Some people believe that toxins are bad for your brain. Some people just do not believe it. I'm one of those who happens to believe it. And we know that there are substances that are usually man-made chemicals that act like estrogens in the body, but they're like the evil twin of the estrogen. So they really increase the side effects of estrogens, for example, in patients with perhaps cancer or predisposition to cancer. And they're called xenoestrogens, or foreign estrogens, which are made by us and not by nature. And for
plastics and
plastics
BPA and these things.
For sure. And now the American Endocrine Society actually put out a position statement where they also acknowledge these estrogen disrupting compounds as health hazards, especially for women, especially pregnant women and children of all ages. And it's been shown that these compounds can have really negative effects on hormonal health, like a thyroid function, but also on fertility, and in a number of reproductive issues in both men and women, especially children. So for me personally, as a woman and as a mom of a little girl, it is really important to avoid toxins as much as I can. For me, that means eating organic as much as I can, and I'm very much aware that it's expensive. It's more expensive than not eating organic. But personally, I'd rather invest in health than something else. Like, I prioritize health. I don't care about having a fancy car or going to a fancy vacation. I'd much rather eat healthy food. So that's my personal choice. Plastic, like you said, is a gigantic issue. We're literally drowning in plastic. And many plastics contain these sort of compounds that literally leak in your food as you reheat the plastic, or as the food just happens to be sitting in these containers for a long enough amount of time. So it's really also important to possibly switch to glass or other safer household tools or cookware as much as possible. Makeup could be an issue. Things like deodorants could be an issue. Toothpaste. Some toothpastes contain dioxytitanium. Why? Why is there titanium in your toothpaste? So, there are quite a few things we can
And going back to
avoid.
what you were originally stating is that there's not always consensus, and part of the reason there's not consensus is it's very difficult to study
Yes.
the long-term impact of these toxins that are there. It's very difficult to know their ability. I mean, I think that if you look at the history of lead, you'll see
Right.
that even recently, the understanding of like how much lead is an acceptable amount of lead, and then finally the understanding of like no lead is acceptable in the body due to our deeper understanding of the science that's out there.
But, I think it's really important that people start talking about it. Because if people demand information, then scientists are given a chance to find out if the information is right or wrong. Right? So it's really important that men and women really demand accurate information for their health. Because the government listens. They really do. It can take a little while, but eventually they will fund the research to provide the answers. Hopefully. Then, of course, it depends on which administration we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think that part of that, separate from administration and politics, part of that is raising the awareness to know what questions to ask.
Right.
To know what questions to ask so that you can start looking in the right direction.
Right.
So from what we've shared so far, for somebody who's looking to take the beginning steps of going down the pathway of improving their life, fundamentally when it comes to the XX brain, right, and the book,
Yes.
what is one important question that women and men, again, I hate to put it that way, but again, let's talk about women, can start asking when it comes to finding the right partner in healthcare, like in a healthcare provider, like because some of these things are so new.
Yes.
We often know like that it can take 12 to 17 years before the medical literature that's out there and understood is implemented at the hospital level.
Oh yeah.
So
that's true.
There's people that are listening that are out there like, wow, this is really interesting. And like, the references, I'll just give an example. The references that come back on a lab result around hormone levels or just even blood work in general, they're just based on the average population. They're not necessarily looking at what's optimal for that individual.
True.
That's at that specific age that's out there. So part of this is there's so many things you can do on your own. Part of this you might need to work with a practitioner or individual that's out there.
Absolutely,
Any
I do.
tips or guidance for people that are looking for the right partner in crime?
It's a really good question. I think, first of all, really understanding your symptoms is a great first step. Like, some women are concerned about menopause, and the question is, do I go to an OBGYN or do I go to an endocrinologist? Right? I'm concerned about Alzheimer's prevention. Do I go to a neurologist? Do I go to a neuropsychologist? Do I go to a psychiatrist? Who do I go to? So I have a whole thing in the book that is really about find the doctor that is right for you. And there are a lot of directions there. Of course, the focus of my book is about women and Alzheimer's prevention in women. So it focuses on that, but there's also links to professional societies with lists of medical professionals that are particularly good for one thing or the other. So that could be a good first step. Number one, identify what concern you have most. And your GP may not be the best person to address all these concerns, although it's certainly good to ask your GP for a referral. But also it's good to look around and see who is being recommended by whom as well.
Let's talk about the center and some of the research that's coming up, or what you're excited about.
Right, or come to us.
Yes.
That's another option. That's another option.
Tell us about some of the things at the center that is coming down the horizon. What are you guys working on next?
Yes.
And what is your hope to study in the coming future?
Ooh, that's great. So when I launched the Women's Brain Initiative, it was me and 2 research assistants. And now we are 25.
And can I pause for 1 second? Because so much of this space, a lot of people weren't talking about prevention.
Right.
Who is an advocate for you in the beginning, in the creation of the center? Like, how did it even come to being?
Okay, so for years, I was applying for grants to look at women's brains, and I really learned how to take a good rejection well. Like, I just got rejected. And then more recently, the field really came together, and now also, I think, also in part because the work that we published showing that there are indeed real differences between men's brains and women's brains in the way we age and in the way that we experience Alzheimer's risks and vulnerabilities to other conditions as well. But I finally got funded. So I went from like 0 grants to look at women's brains. I always had grants, obviously, but not to look at women's brains. And now I have 11, which is incredible.
It's massive. And who was the first grant from?
The NIH. The National Institute on Health.
And that's where it goes back to what you were saying, that the government would listen.
The government was listening. We finally had compelling evidence. And then I went to my chairman, Dr. Matt Fink at Weill Cornell. He's the chairman of neurology. And I said, I really want to do the Women's Brain Initiative. And he said, you know what? Let's do it. You convinced me. Have my full support. Let's do it. So it was really great. And after that, Maria Shriver really helped. Her women's Alzheimer's movement gave us 2 grants over time, and then the Cure Alzheimer's Fund also gave us a big grant. And then I got a really big private donation that led to more donations. And that I think what really made a huge difference for me was the media and being able to do podcasts and writing books so that more people got to learn about research much more easily. It's very hard for a scientist to talk to you. Seriously, it's
You're
true.
doing a pretty good job. Well, you've had a lot of practice.
to have the chance to do podcasts or to be on the Today Show.
Right, they're in their own world.
It's really difficult. Yeah. We're not great at talking.
And oftentimes, it's not encouraged. It's not encouraged to go and talk because it sounds like you are doing advocacy science instead of, but the truth is that how do we build a movement? We have to go to the people. We have to get the people to be excited.
Yes.
You never know who's listening to this podcast who gives the next grant that's there. So you went direct to the public by doing media and TED Talks as well.
Yes, I'm excited about that one.
You have a TED Talk coming up?
It's coming out soon, March 10th.
Yeah, which is fantastic. And I think is an important lesson for everybody is that sometimes when there's gatekeepers, just go direct to the source, go to the people.
Yeah, as scientists, we're really not trained to talk to the public. And for me, it was really Maria Shriver who made a huge difference. She's
doing
such
incredible
a wonderful
work,
woman.
team.
Yes, she's incredible, and she's such an incredible Alzheimer's advocate. And she's just passionate about women's brains and supporting other women, especially women scientists, because she fully understands how unprepared we are to really speak to the public. And I remember the first time that I met her and they invited me to talk about the research at this event. And
was it their annual fundraiser that they do, or?
No, it was an event she was doing in New York. It was like a brain health awareness.
Oh, right. They did one in New York,
luncheon,
Boston. They did a few different cities.
Yes, it was beautiful, really well organized. And she asked me to talk about her work on menopause. And then as I was talking, she would just say, okay, I'm going to stop you right here. Are you trying to say that? Da, 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 da. And I was like, yeah, that's perfect. And it was just, I mean, you know her, so it was perfect that she did that.
She was helping you just translate.
Yeah, just translate.
From science to layman's.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's really, really hard. It's really, you want to be accurate, but you also want people to understand what you're saying.
Because prevention is all about action.
It is all about action.
You want them to take action. You want them to understand that.
You want to inspire people and really give them a reason to believe that they can make it.
Yes.
Yes. At the same time, you don't want other scientists to think that you're not accurate or that, you know, you're being too commercial, in quotes.
Have you had any pushback on your work? Of course, you talked about all the rejection that's out there.
Yes.
And how do you, on a personal level?
Well, meditation helps, for sure. I think a few years ago, you would find me like literally up against the wall, like... Now I just understand that it happens. It just happens. I don't take it personally. I just do my best to really provide all the information and all the validation. I went from publishing a lot of papers to really focusing on things that are very new and spending more time on developing new data and testing new theories. There are different types of scientists. There are the scientists who focus on one thing and just keep doing the same thing over and over and just go bigger and bigger. Like you start with 100 people, then you go to 500, then 1,000, but you're basically just either testing other people's ideas with large data sets or just refining a theory, which is great. But then there are scientists more like me who really take chances. And it takes time to take chances, and you can just find nothing.
You might strike out and nothing comes up.
Nothing comes up, and then you lost 2 years of work. But so far, it's going okay. In fact, I wanted to just mention this because I think you really like it.
Please.
When you said that we can measure hormones in blood, you were saying, well, you know, you want to go to a doctor and you have your labs done. We're not good at measuring hormones. We're really not good. The reference values are enormous. Like for estradiol levels, if you test within 30 and 300 picograms, you're okay, right? Which is a huge variation. The reference range is very
wide.
Yes, it's very wide, and that's in blood. And what I keep telling my patients is that those tests will not predict your symptoms of menopause and will not predict how well you respond to hormonal therapy, because your hormone levels in blood are not correlated with your hormones in your brain. There are two systems, there are two different systems that, of course, speak to each other and are in constant communication with each other, but the hormones inside your brain follow their own criteria because they're not just about reproduction, they're also about a number of other things inside your brain that have nothing to do with whether or not you're fertile or pregnant and whatnot, but they really are needed by the brain to do different things. And we don't have a tool that allows us to measure these hormones in brain. So when women are put on hormone replacement therapy or any kind of hormonal therapy, it's really guesswork because you can't measure it inside a woman's brain. So you don't know where to start, when to start, you know when to stop, and you don't know how much hormones to give because you can't dose it. And so one thing that we're doing now, speaking of taking risks,
yes,
is that we developed a tool to do that. So we now have an imaging technique that will allow us to measure hormones in a woman's brain as soon as we hear back from the FDA.
Wow.
It's with the FDA right now, so fingers crossed.
That's incredible. And to start off, for those that are interested in the topic or maybe have even gone through it, right, hormone replacement therapy,
yes,
top level until you can dial into being able to measure it better,
yes,
what are your top line thoughts about it? What's safe about it? What's not safe about it? What are your just opinions right now from what you've seen that are out there?
So my opinion is that hormonal replacement therapy, or now we call it menopausal hormonal therapy, MHT, has gone through different phases. There was a phase where the hormones became available and everybody got really excited, and then every woman was taking these hormones in massive doses and forever. Then the NIH caught up with the practice. And they said, well, but we really need to test these hormones in clinical trials. And so they started the Women's Health Initiative back in the 1990s. And they had 40,000, 7,000 or more women in these clinical trials. And what they showed was that the hormones were actually increasing risk of heart disease, of strokes, of blood clots, of dementia, and in some women also of cancer.
Yeah, it was groundbreaking. I remember that there was a ton of aunts and other people that were in my family that were on hormone replacement therapy, and then the studies came out, and then like everybody kind of pulled back.
Right. And they just went cold turkey overnight. They just stopped taking the hormones, and then there were a bunch of lawsuits, right, kicked off, and then hormones were the devil. And nobody was touching anymore, nobody was prescribing them. Now I think we are in a better place in that we understand that those early clinical trials were not perfect to start with because the women in the trials were too old. They were like 10, 20 years post-menopause. And what we know about hormones is that it's a system, right? So you have the hormones that acts like a key in a lock. So you have the hormones, and then you need to have a receptor for the hormones. And then the hormones lock to the receptor, and then it's the receptor that triggers a cascade of things that are usually good for you, like energy production or immunity or growth and whatnot. But once the estrogens are not there for a certain amount of time, the receptors shut down. And you can't reopen them. Once they're done, they're done.
There's no lock, but there's a key, but there's no lock.
There's a key, but the lock is jammed.
Yeah.
Right? And so just putting the key in there, in that case, doesn't help your brain. It doesn't help you with the system, with the symptoms that you have, but it can create a number of side effects because at that point, your arteries are harder because you're maybe 70 years old. And we know the estrogen replacement can actually increase the risk of ischemia or blood clots. So instead of preventing heart disease, it can actually make it worse. So basically, just to summarize 20 years of headaches, really, starting hormonal therapy more than 6 years after menopause is not helpful at all. It can actually increase the risk of problems in the brain. If you start hormonal therapy within 6 years of the onset of menopause, it looks like it might help with things like hot flashes or night sweats. It doesn't seem to have an effect on cognitive health. It doesn't improve your cognitive performance, at least as far as we know. We have no idea if starting before menopause actually works, which is something that I would be very interested in testing, especially now that as soon as we have this imaging technique that would allow us to test if the lock is open or not, right? That's what we need to know. The state of your brain. Is your brain receptive to these hormones? And the only way to know is to actually look at it. So I'd be really interested to see if this window of opportunity is a little bit earlier in the process of menopause.
Hey YouTube, if you like this clip with Dr. Lisa Mosconi, you're gonna love this interview with Dr. Dale Bredesen on the end of Alzheimer's.
We are at increased risk when we spend more time indoors. Of course, indoors is where the refrigerator is. Indoors is where the sedentary lifestyle is. Indoors is where the couch and the TV are. All of these things that are